Welcome to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism in Modern Life, hosted by Adam Piercy and Mick Mulroy. Okay, welcome back here to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism with myself, Adam Piercy, and my co-host, Mick Mulroy. Jumping into it today, we were going to do more of sort of a classic episode today, and we were going to talk about someone who is important to all of us who follow Stoicism, which is essentially the founder of Stoicism on its own, Zeno of Citium, who founded the school in the 4th century BCE, I think it is. And Mick suggested this, so I want to make sure I give up the floor pretty quickly, but for those of you looking for a quick guide to learn about Zeno, I would recommend Ryan Holiday's Lives of the Stoics. Ryan's a friend of the podcast. I think it's important to give people modern citations for places they can pull from. But Mick, why don't you open us today with some of your thoughts on Zeno as a founder, and we can maybe tell a little bit of the story of him.
Absolutely, and like you said, we intend to have episodes that are very traditional, obviously talking about the pillars of Stoicism, Zeno being the first, but also attach Stoicism where it's relevant to modern day events. So that's where we're headed. I think it's important. I am not dressed up today because we're doing a traditional podcast. I'm dressed up today because I have to go and debate on TV, obviously, whether nuclear weapons testing is a good idea. I was surprised that they found somebody who thought it was a good idea, but this will be an interesting debate. But that's why I'm all in my, fancy duds here. But as far as Zeno, one, if you do get a chance, I was there because we helped with the humanitarian maritime corridor from Cyprus to Gaza some time ago, and we hubbed out of a town called Larnaca. That was the main port, where we put our food on our barges and sent it over to go into Gaza. And I was running down the beach as I do every morning, basically, not the beach, but run every morning. And I saw this old guy. They had like some kind of contraption on the beach anybody could use to do exercises. And I knew Zeno was from Cyprus, right? But I didn't really know where. Citium, I couldn't find on the map. That's really why I was asking. So I saw this old fella doing some exercise, and I said, "Do you know where Zeno is from on Cyprus?" And he pointed over my shoulder, which is kind of the way Zeno, found Stoicism. And I turned around and there was a big statue of Zeno behind me. You'd think a spy would be a little more situationally aware. But yeah, there he was. And so I was like, oh, so he's not from Larnaca. And the guy said, Larnaca is the new name. Citium was the original name. So I was actually standing in Citium. And then I just kept running down the beach and to where the guy pointed me. And there's still the historic ancient city. It's obviously in ruins of Citium, where Zeno comes from. And it was...
Zeno was born in Xenopolis, Isauria.
Oh, thank you. Cyprus, it's our cyber overlords telling
you about Zeno.
Listening to everything we're saying on the podcast. But it was a Phoenician Hellenized city, which means, obviously Phoenician, I don't know if it's proper to say, but I think they're kind of like the modern, Lebanese.
Yeah, and the name I think means something like sea people, so they were traders, right?
Yeah, right, which makes sense why they'd colonize islands, right?
Yeah.
So there's always been a debate. I'm not here to solve it because, I'm not a historian, but that, Zeno was Phoenician, but he obviously knew Greek because he was in a Hellenized city in Cyprus. And I think the evidence to that is that when they gave Zeno great awards in Athens and basically made him like, father of the city. I don't know if that was the exact terms, but they talked about him obviously in glowing terms, but they talked about him as if he wasn't Greek. and that they were basically giving him an honorary citizenship. So I think, from the novice's perspective, he likely wasn't Greek. So he was Phoenician. So he was from the Middle East. And then, of course, everything that in the statue actually depicts it. From appearance, he was very fit, very thin, not thin, but like lean and mean.
Yeah.
He, and everything we think about Stoicism today, he kind of exemplified. So his dress was very modest, and not, pompous or, like he's trying to show off. He never showed off wealth, even though he was wealthy, right? I mean, the whole story is he was taking like a fleet of ships past Piraeus, which is the port city of Athens, when it sunk, and that's how he ended up in Athens.
Yeah.
And apparently his father was a very, very wealthy trader. And like you said, Adam, the Phoenicians were known for being trading sea people. But he did not highlight his wealth. I don't think he had a problem with wealth, although he started as a cynic, which really, really doesn't like material wealth. He also was very calm, even when things were heated. He always stayed, as we say, very stoic. So he really represented that faction, and he set a standard that was really high. Like, one of the things he said was, even when you're insulted, say nothing.
Yeah.
Right? Try that. Add that to your list of things that you should do to truly be a good Stoic. Even when you're insulted, even when the guy yells at you when you're driving down the street, or you're at work and somebody calls you, bad name or whatever, say nothing. Right? So he did set the standard there. Obviously, and I'd like to hear what you think about his general demeanor before we go into a lot of the concepts that he put out there. But I think many Stoics after him, including today, would do well to look to him not only as the father of Stoicism, with Socrates being the godfather, but actually how to live your life and how to present yourself as a person. I think you'd be well off following the kind of standard he set.
Right. And I think, when we look to him as a source of inspiration and whatnot, what is interesting to me is that he's another one of these people from this period whose works don't really exist anymore. Like, there's a long list of references to his works, and we have very little of that available to us, which I think, personally, looking at the titles, right, things like on life according to nature, on impulse, on passions, on duty, writings on other works like on nature or on the logos, or having just discourses, right? He has all of these writings that we don't get because he's coming from a time where those writings can be lost easily. And I'm personally very disappointed. Like, I think if I had a time machine, right, not to quote the comedian Dennis Leary, but like, yes, I would want to travel back somewhere where penicillin still existed, but also I would try to go to Zeno's time, because there's so much there that we just don't have to us. But one that I think, we should talk about and kind of lead into, because a big part of this, and we did an episode on this, right, was Zeno's Republic. It's probably the one work we know the most about, likely because of how much it, I guess, kept the debate going at the time. So maybe, I know that the Republic, Zeno's Republic, is a big piece of work to you, right, Mick? So maybe we could talk about that a little bit and say, what it did and what it was acting as in that time period.
Yes, absolutely. So one more plug for people that have the privilege, really, of traveling. And it's kind of where we got our name, right? But if you go to Athens, they found the Stoa Polki. So once Zeno, had shipwrecked in Piraeus and basically started following a student of Socrates, he went to Athens. So it's about, about 15 mile walk, 20-mile walk. till you get to Athens, right? So everybody knows the Acropolis, right? Below it was the Agora, which is kind of like the shopping area. It's also very close to where Socrates was executed. Although I don't think they really know where that is, but you can see what they call Socrates Cave. I would say go there just because you're there. It's all very close. And they didn't really know where the Stoipoki, it just means a porch. It's a painted porch. So it was like a big porch, bunch of columns, and then painted scenes of battles that were won in antiquity for them at the time. Unlike, say, Plato, Plato's Academy, which was a literal place. Stoicism, which is very humble, which makes sense, didn't have a place. They simply met on the porch. And then they'd talk, and then they'd walk around the city and the mountains that ring Athens. They'd walk up in the mountains. But they found the porch. It was under a taverna, of course. So they removed the taverna and they dug it up. And I had been going to this pub. It's called the James Joyce Pub, one of my favorites. It's certainly my favorite in Athens. And it turns out it was right next to it was literally like 15 feet. Maybe that's why I liked it so much. I just didn't know. But I would put a plug that go have a pint, if you so abide, or coffee, and next at the James Joyce, sit outside, and you were literally looking right down at the Stoipoki. Mm-hmm. And you could see it being. It probably is much more uncovered now since the last time I was there, but you could see it. I mean, literally, it's almost like our Mecca. So anyway, that's how we get the name of the podcast too. The Porch. But to your point, Adam, I grew up. I mean, everybody read Plato's Republic, of course, Politica. It's the central, like. What did Bertrand Russell say? It's everything else is a footnote to Plato's Republic in philosophy. Totally agree. I grew up reading that. My dad taught a lot of the stories of the allegories that Plato used. But I also read Zeno's very early on. Not the like you said, Adam. It doesn't exist, but there's a lot of writers, Diogenes, several other. Of the followers of Stoicism and Zeno wrote. So we know a lot about what it said.
Yes,
right?
We do.
It was in many ways a counter to Plato's Republic. Plato, I would say he didn't really promote any specific type of governance, but he talked about all of them, including, even the philosopher king is an autocracy, right? It's just an educated autocrat.
Yes. Yes.
Right. So it's important to point that out. It's like, I'd like to have a philosopher. If I was going to have a dictator, I'd like to have one that's actually smart, but it's still a dictator, right? So if you really look at Zeno's, I think, depiction of what a model society is, and I get the people who say, like, that's never going to happen. They're never going to have no laws and no property and all that stuff. But there was the same amount of kind of exaggerated thinking is also in Plato's Republic.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So like, there's never going to be a society that matches either one. So I'm just going to, caveat it with that.
Yeah.
But I do think that Zeno's Republic really is not necessarily a precursor, but certainly a roadmap for modern day democracies. And I think that's an easy case to make, right? Looking at the overall ideas that Zeno depicted in his Republic, starting with equality, right? At the time, and everybody thinks ancient Athens was, it was obviously awesome, and it was a birthplace of democracy. And guess what? That was democracy for Greek men, right? Yes. Right. So women at the time, by the way, were much more liberated in Sparta than Athens. Essentially, in Athens, they were like Taliban level, from my understanding.
Yeah.
Meaning they were essentially meant to stay inside, under wraps, not heard,
yep,
and not taking part in
Can't go
modern
outside
society.
without a veil, right? In ancient
All
Greece,
this.
in ancient
Yep.
Athens, I mean.
Yep. That's a
Yeah,
good point. That didn't just start in other places of the world. It was actually started, or not started, but it was in the, um,
present in
yeah,
Western civilization as well, for
right.
sure.
And which we all view, I think, rightly as birth-based democracy and individual
Hmm.
liberties. But I think if you look at it that way, and he founded the school in 331 BCE. But I think if you look at it that way, um, he really promoted the ideas that philosophers that have promoted democracy throughout history have emulated. It really started with him. So the equality, for sure, I think he pushed very hard at a time when people didn't even consider it an issue. I would also say meritocracy, right? And what I mean by that is inside of his equality. So whether you're a slave, a female, uh, from another place other than Greece, which he obviously was. So that's a little self interest, but I think he was across the board, believe that. It was your ability to reason that would sway the debate and be the model for how to govern. So that's meritocracy, right?
Yeah,
It's not because your father was rich or because you have some divine claim to leadership, as Plato talked about the noble lie. It was essentially everybody has a shot, and it's based on your ability to reason, which he thought everybody can, and that the reason was which should lead the development of governance for a place. Right? And I have a list so in my head. So if you have any comments on that before I go on, let me know.
no, I think let's continue with that thread. So go ahead.
Yeah. So the next thing, the rule of law, right? So the rule of law is a bedrock in democracies. It's not whoever rules is the law.
Yeah,
The opposite of that is uh, we decide collectively through democracy, either representative democracy or direct democracy,
yeah,
like Athens was for at least for a time, um, what the rules are. And guess what? Everybody has to abide by them, whether you're on top of the socioeconomic ladder or the bottom. Um, Again, it goes with equality. It goes with the idea of logic and reason. But the basic rule of law is a tenet in every democracy around the world today. Um, and in the U.S., and I was an attorney a long time ago, uh, but you can see how that played out even in the U.S. Constitution.
yeah,
The concepts that we're talking about now are very easily identified in the U.S. Constitution. And I don't think it's an accident. And I don't think they just had similar ideas. I think it's because the history of Western civilization has always included these very core Stoic um, constructs, and that it simply impermeated our thought, whether it was the Magna Carta, you know, U.S. Revolution, the French Revolution. I imagine it had a big impact on Canadian jurisprudence and
absolutely.
governance.
Yeah.
So I think you can see it. It's very clear.
Yeah, and I think that's a key thing to kind of highlight right now in the conversation, because Zeno is writing this at a time where the Peloponnese, the area of Greece that makes up, you know, Athens, Sparta, all that area, right, is constantly under threat of autocracy in some way, right?
Yeah.
It's threat from the east, from Persians, from the Macedonians. Then there's threats from within the Peloponnese, with the city states warring with each other. And so, I think his discussions about the rule of law being paramount, I think, are very important because, there's a chance you're going to get a dictator or an autocrat who's going to take over. And I think it's important to note just how radical this concept is of like, you might be the strongest, but that shouldn't mean that it doesn't apply to you, right?
Right.
And it's important to put that into context here, because he's not saying this as an armchair philosopher or a philosophy teacher, or, sitting in a room somewhere. He's saying this out loud as essentially a rebuttal, or at least a dialogue with the Republic coming out from Plato, and saying, I don't think that the way it's going is going to be okay. I think we have to have law to make it an even sort of ground for everybody else, so that there's no one person who's above it and everybody else isn't below it. Everybody has to meet this one level of sort of standard. So in some ways, I almost feel like it's a protest in some ways, where he's saying, like, I disagree with your autocracy. But he doesn't say that outright, but I think it is something that's there. And it is an important thing to highlight, right? He's saying this, at a time where that's the case. And for you and I, not to go into it too deep, but for you and I on this podcast, we have talked about some of the challenges to democracy today. And I think, law above all is an absolute important concept to get around. I think Stoics really rallied around that as they were going about their business. So at a time and a place where, like, we are in relative security and safety, hugely where we are. You in the United States, me in Canada, and many of our listeners come from, the English speaking world and Western countries that are relatively stable compared to that. But, we should not forego the fact that the context of that was huge for them. You could be free one day and a slave the next, right? So,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And as you know, my group does a lot of stuff in conflict areas around the world and humanitarian. And not only should we realize how good we have it in the West, but we should realize how others don't, right? So,
Yeah.
And understand that collectively, it's not just the U.S., but collectively, a lot of the very developed world has cut their support to these crises around the world. And I'm talking basic core support, like children getting fed, and
Yeah.
it's had a huge impact. But not to go get on my soapbox, which I guess I am right now. But get to back on my Stoic soapbox, which I consider one of the same. The other things that I think were core to the Republic of Zeno was universal education. Right, it goes with meritocracy, and it goes with the idea that we want the best, and the best will come out through education. Right, if only the rich get educated, and all the serfs essentially go from being an infant to working in the fields, we're not going to get the best, right? So the whole idea of a philosopher king, we refer to a philosopher king, kind of the meritocracy of the Roman leaders, that actually had to do with the fact that they could choose one rather than just have that person be the genetic heir, right? And that's why there's so much focus on, who many consider to be the philosopher king, Marcus Aurelius, making what many would say the wrong choice with picking Commodus Vice, going with meritocracy of which is how he was chosen, the Pax Romana, the five, right, good emperors. But this concept really started there with the idea that, and he was revolutionary when he said, hey, women can go to school too, or should go to school too.
Yeah.
I was like, what? That's a core or principle. Another core principle of today is human rights.
Yes.
Like, it's hard to believe at one time people were like, what? It was like either you fought and got it or you didn't. And either you ended up in the have class or the have nots. But human rights really is for the people who can't necessarily stand up for themselves. Right? You don't need a king to have human rights, right? Yes, he's the king or she's the queen, right? So it is a protection of the minority, is another way to say it. So
Right.
it is, and which is a core principle of all democracies. It's not just democracy in mob rules, right? Is another way to look at it. If you can easily keep down the minority, either
Mm-hmm.
philosophical minority or, racial or ethnic groups or religious minority.
Yeah.
If you don't have this universal concept of human rights, which means anybody and everybody should have a core set of rights that can't be taken away.
Yeah. And I think that there's a thread that runs between other people in this, like Musonius Rufus and whatnot, about this equality of education, equality of access to education. I should say it more like that, because I don't know. It just like, well, there's a common concept that runs through Stoicism, which is like of the beehive, right? What's good for the hive is good for the bee, and I feel like this is a concept that really resonates with that, the education concept, right? Like in some ways, I think Zeno's taking a stand on this in a place where, as we've already highlighted, was very patriarchal and like I would say chauvinistic, right? And then on the flip side, so I think he's doing that because he's trying to protest against that. But on the flip side, I think as well, he has a basic belief, at least I felt like this, and many Stoics have this, where it's sort of like if we all get more educated, then we all kind of move up together, right? I do think, in some ways, like as much, it's interesting because we were talking about this concept in an earlier episode about Stoicism and its connection to the military, right? And some people think it's connection to war, but I think it's more the connection to the military, which is not the same thing.
Yeah,
but I think Stoicism has a deep connection to education. Like you should have access to these things. You should talk about these things. You should look for wisdom. I mean, wisdom is a core concept of the 4 basic tenets of Stoicism, right? And, I think it starts with people like Zeno from the beginning when they say everybody should be able to be educated, right? And I'm probably stretching that out a little bit from what was said back in the original text. But at the same time, for someone in that period to say women should be able to be taught is like like I said, it's almost a form of protest towards the common everyday life that was, ancient Greece. So that's something that I think is really important to bring up, right? In a day and age today where people are, where it almost feels like there's a war on education, or people talk about the educated elite. And I'm always like, I was brought up in a time and place where education was meant to be, a path towards higher levels of existence for everybody. And I've always believed that. And I feel like that does align well with Stoicism. But, in the time where this is happening, like just talk about slaves being educated. I mean, that slavery is not exactly slavery in this time period is a lot different than slavery in later periods of human history. But, I do think it's again, some kind of protest. So did Zeno have slaves? That's an interesting thing that people ask. And you kind of go, I don't think we would know. Maybe he did. I don't think he would have, but maybe he did.
I don't think he would have. I mean, not just because I want to defend him, which I do, but I've never seen any indication that he did.
Yeah.
Nor do I think his economic status would have allowed it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an interesting.
Let's hear from our
history listeners.
Yeah, history listeners.
Yeah, from our
I've never seen
archaeologists.
anything that even question that. No.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think in some ways it's probably irrelevant because there were so many types of slavery back in the day than the type of slavery that we hear most about today. I'm not saying slavery is good. We're not saying that. We are saying instead that at that time period, it was a much different thing. You could sell yourself into economic slavery for a set period of time back in the day, for example, in order to pay off debts. So it's one of those things where it's not, that's still not great, but it's certainly a thing. So, but yeah, I think this thread of education is important to highlight from him because he talks about it. Then Musonius talks about it. Epictetus himself, when he comes about, is an educated slave at first, right? And I think, that's a key thread.
Absolutely. Another part that we've talked about, because it has to do with the First Amendment too, is this idea of public discourse and deliberation.
Yeah.
Right. So he promoted that, I think, pretty strongly in his Republic. And we're seeing, certainly in autocracies, you see the absence of free speech, right? You become a terrorist if you say something against the powers that be, and you're basically silenced. We saw it during we talked about the Stoic opposition during many of the bad emperors, if you will, of the Roman Empire. And one of the things that some of them were executed for simply speaking out against what they disagreed with. And the last thing that I will highlight for on the Zeno's Republic that I think is very, very relevant today is this idea of a global citizen, right? Cosmopolis, which is a big tenet of Stoicism. The way I viewed it and the way I see it is very relevant today, and maybe it's just the way I view the world, but it is not that we're going to have one giant government. That's not going to work. We can barely do the governments that we have now efficiently or in any manner that would indicate we could do a worldwide government. But to me, it is that we should promote the ideas that we've been talking about and that are democratic principles because it's good for, like you said, it's not just good for the individual to be educated. It makes society better. Right. It makes society better that people it's a meritocracy where the most capable are selected, not just in political leadership, but all leadership. And that's good. And I think we should promote that around the world. And I think we should base our alliances on that. So when I think of global citizenship, that's what I do. And we've talked about this as well. The rise of autocratic systems is intense.
Yes.
It's going up. Civil liberties is going down around the world. People who live in a place where they can speak freely are becoming less and less. So I equate the two, that the idea of global citizenship is that it's to promote the idea internationally of individual civil rights, a democracy based on the power of the people, not the power of, the sword, so to speak. And that was something that he pushed, certainly at a time when most people wouldn't even have had a clue what he was talking about. But I think even if you disagree with it, today you'd say, yeah, I know what you're talking about. It's globalism. You're a globalist, right? It's a bad word for your isolationist, right?
Yeah.
That's not necessarily what I'm saying. I'm a globalist by their definition, different than what I'm saying. But the idea of kind of like the shining city on the hill, democracies should support one another and set the course for other countries to follow. That I think is very much in keeping with this concept.
Totally. And, there's even a basic part of Zeno's story, which I think relates to globalism, which is the fact that as a Phoenician coming to Athens, he's technically an outsider, right? He's a Hellenized Phoenician. You're totally right, but he's coming from the outside. And I think, you've got, like, in terms of globalism, he comes from trade and he comes from, essentially someone who moves around for a living, right? And he enters into Athens at a time where not every outside group is really looked upon favorably, right? There's definitely some xenophobia at the time, right? Greece definitely has,
right?
What's that?
That's where the word came from, right?
Yeah, well, exactly, right.
Not Zeno, but
Not Zeno,
Greek.
no, but
Right.
because there's the Greek concept of xenia, which is this
Yeah.
idea of like the open door, you welcome in outsiders. Then there's xenophobia, which is actually a fear of the outsiders, which is it's an interesting dichotomy of Greece. I'm sure we could do a whole podcast on that. But I think when we talk about globalism today, right, there's a lot of discussions today, and I won't go into them, but there's a lot of discussion today about immigration and free trade and all of that stuff. And then you can see that these are, and I know I've said this before on the podcast, these are concepts that we were wrestling with 2,500 years ago, right? And we're still trying to sort that out. But ultimately, Zeno, I think, as a symbol of who he is as a man, he's coming from Phoenicia. Like there's a whole thing about ancient Greece being, a bunch of old white guys. Well, Zeno's not. He's not from Greece. He's from another place, and he's bringing in a philosophy and a concept that the Greeks, I was reading a thing about how the Greeks thought that he was like Cadmus. Cadmus was a famous hero who brought the alphabet to the Greeks, is what they used to say. And so it's like, so this globalist idea is actually something that resonates deeply within the Zeno story because he's not from Greece, right? He brings them, they say, when he was buried with high honors, right? And so I think that's important for people to realize, but I mean, this is the same with everything. I mean, throughout Stoicism, you have these people that don't come from the place where it's always thought to originate from, right? I'm trying to think what his name is. Nero's. So that's Marcus and Epictetus and
Seneca?
Seneca. Excuse me, Seneca. Seneca's
Yeah.
from Spain, which is a
Yeah.
Roman province, but he's not from
Yeah.
Rome, right? And all of that. And I think there is a globalist link to a lot of that stuff, and we have to take that into account with his story. So now there's something interesting you were talking about. I'd like to interject a little bit and bring this up because it was an interesting thing. And Ryan's book, Lives of the Stoics, brings this up. He says that it's actually not known when the shipwreck occurred in that story about how Zeno got started in philosophy. It's not known whether or not the shipwreck made him destitute or whether it was just such a bad shipwreck that it shook him emotionally. He obviously comes from a family of traders. The Phoenicians were all traders, really, in many cases. People, of course, in Phoenicia would do other things, but it's like for someone in Zeno's position, he would have been a trader. And It was interesting I was rereading Ryan's chapter in Lives of the Stoics on this, where he talks about how we don't know whether maybe after this, he wasn't really monetarily affected, but it did make him rethink his life to see this, great fortune wash up on the shores of Piraeus. And I thought that was an interesting thing to kind of talk about quickly as well, which was, Zeno we don't really know what his background is, but I think that in many ways, he really wouldn't want us to care. Like he doesn't talk about wealth in any way, shape, or form, like it's a good thing or a bad thing. He sort of has, he's sort of indifferent to it, right? But at the same time, I think it's important to note that if he was a really rich trader and this would have only taken away 1% of his wealth and he would have still been fine forever, he's still someone who, with all of this money, who didn't have to care about anything and could maybe he would never need it to worry about anything and work another day in his life anyways. He still takes the time to form this philosophy where the greater good is a key concept there, right? And I think that's a really important thing going on today. There's a lot of talk today about where the wealth sits and what people are doing with their wealth. And I'm not gonna say anything specific on that one, but I think, I would look to someone like Zeno. When people say they read Stoicism, and we've talked about Stoicism being something misconstrued as a money philosophy, Zeno himself is like, he almost never talks about it. He completely talks about teaching everyone and law for everyone, and it's a very social philosophy, right? And I think that's a key thing to take away from his life is that, if he did lose everything, then it's still a great story because he lost everything and then built a philosophy up that allowed him to overcome that. But if he didn't lose everything and this merely changed his life around, then, it's almost a Dickensian story of like, he learned that he needed to be better for everybody else and and created a philosophy of caring about the greater good more than anything. And that to me is an interesting story. It would be great to know, but we'll never know. It's too long ago now, but it's an interesting thing.
That's an interesting debate and one that will never be settled. But just thinking about it logically in the two scenarios you laid out, Adam. So if he did come from, and everybody does think he came from a wealthy trader family.
Yeah.
So he either didn't lose everything, but he still decided to focus on philosophy and developing this. But even if he did lose everything, if he was more interested in wealth, he would simply go back to his family and start over, right?
Exactly.
I mean, they didn't all. I mean, at least that we know of, they didn't all perish in the shipwreck. So,
right.
If that was truly the case, and he was not the person we think he is, he could have just got another ship back to. I mean, Cyprus ain't that far.
No.
And gone back to trading, which he obviously knew how to do. So I think either way, what happened was he was inspired to do something other. And there's nothing wrong with business. I mean, I speak at a lot of Stoic events that have business persons. I mean, a lot.
I work in a normal company, so I get it. I understand it.
Somebody's got to pay the taxes, right?
Yeah, somebody's got to pay the bills,
right? So, I'm not a business person necessarily, but I certainly, I don't know how you could be anti-business, but I guess some people are. But that is, it's not about like it's bad to have. And I think that's one of the reasons why I left cynicism. Cynicism would, I mean, at least at the time, not the way we view the word, was just completely against material wealth.
Yeah.
But then you'd ask, well, how do they get fed? Well, because the people who make money feed them, right? That's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
Well, that's like, okay, well, that's that's not. I don't know, but it's another speculation on my part.
Yeah.
Feel free to disagree with me. That's one of the reasons why he left cynicism, started Stoicism, is he realized that this idea that you could just exist and not work to gain any kind of material wealth was also a fallacy.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, what if everybody did that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I think he would say there's an accountability probably for the wider society that we live in. Right. And
especially if you do well.
Yes, especially if you do well. But I read an interesting passage that maybe we should try to close with, which is like, I read an interesting passage where someone said, nobody ever gave me everything. And then it was like, oh, so the roads that you drove on to work, the computer system that you used, all of those things, like you did all of that, right? It's like, you have to remember that we are this greater sort of connected society. And Zeno, I think would always have resonated with him, that we are an interconnected web of people, even people you don't know. You are somehow touched in your life by them and they by you. So, which I think is really important. So, but it's probably a good point for us to close here. But I think, I would urge everyone, right? Because a lot of people ask Mick and I when we go to events or when we talk about this, a lot of people ask us like, where do I start and whatnot? And I would say totally start with the three big ones, right? Marcus, Seneca, and Epictetus. Excuse me for forgetting Seneca earlier. But the thing is that, we do know a lot about the original creator of this, right? And what's very important to know, I forgot, we want to make sure that we say this, that when the Stoics had an opportunity to pick a name for their philosophy, they were given basically two options, right? Which was pick a different name or go with Zeno and call themselves Zenoans or Zenos or something like that. And they intentionally chose not to choose Zeno's name because they didn't want a cult of personality. They didn't want it to be, an acolyte of Zeno. It's more like, we're Stoics. That's what we are. And, I think that's a really important thing here because it's sort of, there's a selflessness to that. I don't think Zeno wanted everyone. I really don't think Zeno would have wanted everyone to think about him in some, so sort of king of philosophy type of way. But I think it's important for everybody out there. I think Mick and I would both recommend learning a little bit more about him. He's a really interesting person. I wish we had all his writings. He has so much out there that's lost. But yeah, so do you have any closing thoughts for us today, Mick, before we sign off?
Well, only that, Zeno's closing thoughts when at least legend has it, when he died, he accepted it without, drama, without anything. He just said, I guess it's my time, essentially, right? And I think, so my closing remarks are that Zeno kind of set the standard, not just, for the birth of the philosophy, but how to live, how to be, and what to value.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you, Mick, for today's conversation. That was great. And everyone else, we'd love to hear from you, especially your first thoughts on Zeno, or if you're just encountering him now or differently. So feel free to reach out to us. But for now, we'll sign off. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Pup and Porch podcast. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast or its host, head over to pupandporch.com, and you can listen to all our episodes on Spotify, Apple, or whichever platform you prefer. And if you'd like to help out with the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. Drop us an email if you have a comment on any past episode, you have a suggestion for future episodes, or you have an essay on an important topic for Stoicism. Send it to us, and then we can be reached at info@pupandporch.com. Today's music was provided by bensound.com. Until next time, Pup and Porch out.